We're looking today at the decade following World War II. One person in this congregation talked about German prisoners of war who had been interned in northern Ontario during the war. When it ended, he said they went home, gathered their families, and applied to come to Canada to live. How hard to love your neighbor. Another woman in this congregation talked about a Japanese family who were stripped of their possessions and sent to a camp in the interior for the war. And they returned to that same community after the war, bought new property, and started to rebuild from nothing. How hard to love your neighbor. Someone in our Bible study said, I have a hard time loving people who are committing bylaw infractions. What a commitment that decade required of people after a war like that to decide to love their neighbors. Equally difficult was the commandment to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Coming out of a war that had wrought such disaster on humanity and the world, many people struggled with their love of God. A God who loved them, a God who loved the world, who sent Jesus to save us. They examined their own experiences of suffering and knowledge of what had happened and what their churches had said or not said. And they wondered where God was. And it brought a lot of people into spiritual crisis. Love God and love your neighbor. The simplest thing to remember and the hardest thing to do. There is a reason that this is a commandment. If it were easy, we wouldn't be told to do it. And in the Ruth reading, you've heard in music and in story and in scripture about a group of women who had lost all the men in their lives. Husbands, sons, fathers, father-in-law. Alone and vulnerable in the world, they had to rebuild their lives. They made different choices. Orpah went back home to her family to start in a familiar place, and Ruth made the decision to stick with her husband's mother, to go to a new place and a new culture, loving the person she was with and committing herself to life in Naomi's world. The decade following the war asked that of a lot of women as well. So this is the third decade that we're commemorating in the history of the United Church in Canada. In this series, we're learning a lot about the challenges of people of faith and what they have faced in every decade. Every month we're looking at Indigenous connections, church life in the context of Canada's life, one publication that the church wanted people to read, and we'll sing a hymn written in the era. Today we're looking at 1945 to 1955, a time of incredible dynamism, both for the church and the country. The war is over, bringing a joy-filled optimism to the country after years of battle, absence, rationing, blackouts, and reading through the papers for the lists of the dead and missing. People took to the streets in celebration. Soldiers started returning to their homes, communities, and families. As soon as they were back, they were granted a 30-day leave and then returned to civilian life. The Department of Veteran Affairs, which had just been created in 1944, gave them $100 to buy civilian clothes. They gave them $7.50 per month of service. And if they were overseas, they gave them 25 cents a day, plus 1 week's salary for every 6 months they had spent overseas. Many soldiers had left the country in a depression economy, but they returned to a busy and robust era. Years of war had created a demand for all the resources Canada had to offer, and the post-war called for even more. Europe rebuilding meant there was a seemingly bottomless market for Canadian resources. Grains, next one. Grains, fruits and vegetables, meat, dairy, and eggs were all needed. The country and the world wanted fish that was processed and ready for transit. We were mining everything from iron ore to copper, aluminum, nickel, and gold, to energy fuels like coal and uranium. And wood products were in high demand for home construction. Returning soldiers wanted homes, and the downtown neighborhoods were growing too crowded and dilapidated for housing. Adding to the returning population were an additional 157,000 newcomers, people displaced by war in Europe. The largest groups of displaced persons were Poles and Ukrainians, but there were also a significant number of Holocaust survivors, Jews, as well as Croatians, Czechoslovakians, Estonians, Hungarians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Romanians, and Yugoslavians. And others were not refugees, but were looking for a new start, like the Dutch, the Swiss, the Swedes, and the Danes. Our diversity was growing. So suburbs sprang up with new housing developments everywhere. With rapid expansion, we needed oil and gas and electricity to power and heat them. And that advantage finally extended into the rural areas of the country, allowing small towns and farms to have the convenience and stability of a reliable power grid. The United Church grew and prospered as the country was doing. Church people were going out into the suburbs and seeing where there was an interest in building churches in these new neighborhoods. They were encouraged to visit non-church neighbors and bring them in. Membership classes and Christian education was prioritized. They often met in schools until their church was built. This is a Japanese congregation in southern Alberta where interned people built a congregation after the war ended. They were 5 little rural communities that the minister served on a bicycle. They were able to build a physical church 25 years after the war. The United Church Women's Association gave women opportunities to network, and these women were central in fundraising for building local churches. They also fundraised for everything else. Regional Christian training centers across the country, like Naramata, presbytery camps on lake properties, and better pensions for their aging ministers. Mortgage burning events were commonplace. And there were lots of people entering the ministry, but more were needed, especially in the rural and resource communities of our country. Many of the new ministers to the West came from rural Ontario and the Maritimes. I couldn't resist putting in a picture of my own dad, Donald Lang, who heard the call to ministry in this era. Reverend Barry Cook and Reverend Bob Burrows were in the same era and in the same school at the time. Churches held membership classes, groups for men, women, couples, and youth. The National Church had received a statement from chaplains who served in the Great War No. 2 that described the widespread lack of knowledge about the Bible and the theological issues among Protestant men in service. And here's a quote from a historian, Don Schweitzer. A quote from the report said, "One is forced to admit that Protestant churches are producing men whose moral lives are admirable, but whose morality is not grounded in the Christian faith. How long will such a morality endure?" So there were lots of adult study classes and Bible studies. But the main focus was on the growing number of children. We hadn't yet hit the peak of the baby boom in the church, but Sunday schools were rapidly growing and needing classrooms. The Young People's Union saw its height in this era and became the place to source leadership in the church, both lay and ordained. They offered young people leadership training, social and fun events, faith exploration, community engagement, and a place to meet like-minded people. Prosperity was on the nation. Now that people had some disposable income, they started to get married in church buildings rather than in the minister's house with the minister's wife as a witness. They could afford now to invite and host a number of guests for a meal and a party. With new roads, good money, manufacturing and oil production firing hot, it all made room for one of the great passions of the era, the car. The Sunday drive became a pastime in both rural and urban areas. It was a common family activity in the time between Sunday worship in the morning and the Sunday meal at night. People took their cars to the movies with the whole family. They took their cars out to dinner. In 1955, the White Spot in Vancouver served an average of 10,000 cars a day. And in the new homes, there were game-changing electric appliances. Homes moved from the icebox to the refrigerator, from the sweeper to the vacuum cleaner, and from the wringer washer to the automatic wringer washer. But one of the most significant culture shifts was the television. It brought the world into people's homes, not just the sounds, but the sights. And for the first time in most people's lives, fans got to see Hockey Night in Canada, and they were glued to it every Saturday night. The United Church in this era had a lot of respect and influence. It was the largest Protestant denomination in the country. Its buildings occupied prominent places in large cities and small towns. And the leaders of the church, provincially and nationally, were invited to sit down with premiers and prime ministers on a regular basis to talk about public policy, social policy, and the needs of the country. But alongside this optimism and the frenetic energy and the strength and the increase in prosperity, the era also came with its difficulties. These are shipbuilders who worked on the North Shore during the war. Women who learned trades, had upward mobility and good incomes. When men returned, they were dismissed from their jobs. They could return home for no pay or get secretarial or other house cleaning work for low pay. Many employers would not employ women, particularly married women. This included the civil service and the United Church of Canada. If a woman minister decided to marry, she was dismissed from her work. Many women in this era were widowed in the war, and they were the only adults supporting their households. So economically, with the prospect of only low-wage jobs, it became a huge struggle for many. And a number of men who returned from battle came home hurt. Some with very visible scars and some scars that were deep within them. Many of these men were changed from the people they had been before the war. Some marriages were violent, others silent. Many families were deserted at this time. Some marriages had been impulsive acts before a soldier was shipping out, and when he returned, they realized they didn't know each other at all. In other places, jobs in the resource economy kept men away from their families for months at a time. Fishing, mining, logging, or working in the oil patch. So marriages were under huge strain and were breaking up. But divorce at the time was difficult, rare, and hard to access. The only two grounds for divorce were gross physical cruelty or adultery, which was hard to prove. What happened when a partner had been deserted or a marriage simply fell apart? This was one of the questions the church wanted its people to examine, and it petitioned governments to loosen restrictions around divorce. The publication the church wanted people to read was the report on the Commission on Christian Marriage and the Christian Home. Many years of study went into it, and it was controversial when it came out. They had a conversation in it about guidance for women's place in the home. They wanted broader access to divorce. They talked in the report about the potential use of birth control. They waded into thorny issues, the possibility that women may be as sexually active as men outside of the marriage, and that couples may be having sex outside of the intention of having children. And then there was the thorny question of mixed marriages. And that meant, of course, marrying a Catholic. Canadians had been raised in a separate school system and didn't tend to meet each other across the Catholic-Protestant divide. And the war changed that. It brought both soldiers and people at home in the workplace face to face with each other, and many people thought that those people were pretty darn fine, despite what their respective churches taught. Politically, the church advocated for new immigrants to Canada and set up language and school supports in resource towns. They advocated for a social safety net for poor families who needed income support. They continued to advocate for the decriminalization of birth control. And they advocated for a national health care program that would not impoverish sick people. The church got some of what it wanted and not others. But the cozy relationship that the church had with government at the time grew more cool and less effective when the church petitioned the government to no effect on issues against gambling, against the liquor trade, and against commercial sports on Sunday. In this era, the church was still tied to its partnership with the government in the residential school system for Indigenous children. Although they advocated for more day schools to be implemented rather than requiring long periods of living in residence, the church continued to support the course toward assimilation. In terms of a hymn, Bryn and I found it very hard to find a hymn written in this era. While newness and rebuilding were all around them, the church of that time seemed to take comfort in the familiar hymns of the past. But we did find one, written just at the end of the decade. It's called "Let There Be Peace on Earth," and it invited every individual to embody the peace they longed for.